I think DeFi is pretty good at the audit side of things, but is not super great at the operational security side of things. Like,
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Ship Safely podcast. I'm your host, Sebastian, and today we're joined by the one and only Abhishek Kannan. Abhi's journey starts in research at a company called Staking Rewards. It's a well-known company from this staking space, and he was there before moving to Swell Network, where he was the chief strategy officer. And at Swell, he closed over $1 billion worth of Ethereum flows. Today, he's operating at the cutting edge of institutional DeFi and high frequency infrastructure as the CEO of Liquid Labs, who are building not one, but three amazing products. One is called Faro, and maybe everyone knows this. It's an AI native trading application. Then they're also building Hyperwave Prime, and last but not least, Ignition. Now, we're going to focus on Ignition in this episode, which has evolved from something which was called Tempest Finance to become the foundational liquid staking infrastructure for the high-speed FOGO blockchain. And it will be soon expanding to bring yielding RWAs and stocks directly on chain. Abhi, it's great to have you here.
likewise, really keen to be here and to chat more about what we're building with Ignition, the vision, and yeah.
Amazing. So to start things off, I'm going to ask you the same question I ask everyone else. Why do you think people should stay and listen, and what should they take away from this conversation?
Yeah, for sure. I think like one of the most interesting things about FOGO is I think it's just a redesign of how to think about blockchains. The blockchains thus far have been really focused on how do we scale global consensus. I think what we have seen, even with all the efforts that Solana has put into making global consensus as efficient as possible, FOGO sort of took that and flipped it on its head and said, okay, we've seen what worked with Hyperliquid, which was sort of putting all these validators together in Tokyo. How can we implement that on a more efficient execution environment, with the main difference between a chain like Hyperliquid and FOGO being that in Hyperliquid, you have this separation between the EVM and HyperCore. There's sort of these two different execution environments, and like while that is great for making the trading side of things as good as possible, I think what we have seen evident with the Hyper EVM is that there hasn't actually been a lot of interconnectedness between these two execution environments. FOGO takes a different approach by taking the already hyper efficient execution environment of Solana and taking it to the extreme. And that allows you to have a perp DEX, which is going to be launching soon on FOGO called Superluminal, living at the exact same level as all of the DeFi happening on FOGO. And that's not a pitch about us, but we're just super excited to be building on FOGO. And yeah, so that's what we find exciting.
100%. Like I wanted to say, like this sounds like a great FOGO pitch, actually. So you're like a big FOGO champion.
Yeah, for sure.
So let's start from the beginning. Like, what's your story and how did you get here? You had an amazing journey in Web3, so want to hear more about that.
Yeah. I've always been like a super data nerd, and that's what led me to originally working at a company called Staking Rewards. While I was there, I was writing a lot of the data pipelines for all the different proof of stake blockchains. So I was sort of being thrown all over the place, having to understand how all of these different proof of stake blockchains work, all the way from all of the Cosmos chains to everything on Polkadot, Kusama, all the way to Ethereum, mainnet, and a bunch of like fringe stuff that I don't think exists anymore. This was back in like 2020, 2021, when there were like 100 different chains. There was like, Tezos and all of these chains. And so yeah, it was a super great experience in understanding how a lot of these different systems worked. And then yeah, I moved over to Swell. Swell, we launched our LST and our LRT, and this was during like the peak of restaking. We scaled the protocol to 3 billion, and still today, manage a few hundred million in Ethereum stake. And then it took us to like all the way throughout building Swell. One of the things we found super difficult was that I think at the end of the day, LSTs are super hard to differentiate on. We see this with Ignition today. Like the first product we launched was our LST, but that was never the end goal. I think what we have seen with perp dexes, and especially on Hyperliquid, is like although Hyperliquid has portfolio margin, I think the pipe dream of the EVM was to sort of introduce yielding portfolio margin, and I think while that's been somewhat achieved, having Superluminal sit on the same execution layer as what we're building with Ignition allows us to do things like what we're doing now, which is we're going to be launching our RWA product very soon. And the way that we thought about RWAs is like, sure, we could probably go out and like try to issue the RWAs ourselves, but a lot of these RWAs actually already exist on other chains. And so why not give users a way to take these same RWAs and issue them directly onto FOGO, and then you don't fragment the RWAs. You have these existing products that are already working, and you're able to mint them directly on FOGO, and also obviously burn them as well, and get back your USD and extend that same thing to stocks as well. That's probably coming later down the line.
Yeah, that pretty much also answers my next question. So I'm gonna skip that one and jump right to the third question, which is I think like ties into what you've said in the beginning. So like from what I heard you saying in the introduction, FOGO is, the right place to build Ignition, right? But like, can you walk us through a few of the key points and key decisions that led you to build on FOGO, this super specialized layer one with purifier dancer? Like what were the, specific features that you said like, oh, no other chain has this, like it wouldn't work as well on anything else. So like we need to build on FOGO, and that's going to be the winning move.
Yeah, for sure. I think the best place to start with this is like what made Hyperliquid win. Hyperliquid had one somewhat of a first mover advantage. It wasn't the first perp dex, but it was the first perp dex that had all of the right things it needed to actually be successful. So what Hyperliquid nailed really was the UX. And then also the way they went around their token was obviously, I think, phenomenal. I think we've seen the industry really change from what Hyperliquid has done with their token, and combining these two things together, I think gave Hyperliquid the critical mass to be where it is today, where people continue to use Hyperliquid in an environment where there's no incentives to use Hyperliquid beyond the actual utility of the product. And I think that is something very rare in crypto that we don't see very often, is most times users are chasing an incentive, and Hyperliquid has been able to get product market fit and retain product market fit, even though there's no longer any incentives. And so, why FOGO and why for Ignition? So, Ignition, I would say today is not a great user of what FOGO has. The key things that FOGO brought us to FOGO was one, FOGO is extremely fast, and this is what you need for a native implementation of a perp dex on the base chain. So Hyperliquid is a specialized execution environment that's very different to FOGO, where FOGO is aiming to do everything Hyperliquid does, but on a generalized execution environment, which I think is a completely different engineering challenge in and of itself. And the second thing is FOGO implemented this thing called sessions, which is essentially what you have on the Hyperliquid UI across the entire chain. And I think this UX first and speed at all costs first thing was the thing that drew us to building on FOGO. And for us, building an LST, I would say it's relatively uninteresting, but I think where it does become interesting is when we start bringing RWAs on chain, as I think where we see FOGO going into the future is that everything will trade on FOGO. price discovery will happen on FOGO because you are able to build these market dynamics that aren't possible anywhere else. You've seen this in Superluminal's design and the stuff they've implemented, like the first on-chain implementation of dual flow batch auctions, and the perp decks being able to correct directly into DeFi allows you to have things like portfolio margins sit outside of Superluminal. So, Pyron is one of the other protocols building on the chain. They're building their borrow lend protocol, and you can have this direct interconnection between the two that is permissionlessly possible. So on Hyperliquid, portfolio margin is built by the Hyperliquid team. There was no really nice way to do it from the Hyperwave VM. Like it's always, I would say like a patchwork solution, and that's not what we see on FOGO. And so yeah, that's what sort of drew us and inspired us to be on FOGO.
After hearing you talk about FOGO, I'm becoming more and more bullish on it. Like the overall overarching topic for this podcast is security. So of course I'm going to ask you a question about that. As the CEO of a large Web3 company, you're managing some pretty big institutional flows. How do you balance, the trade-off between a very good user experience, but also ensuring, that your systems are secure?
Yeah, I think it's a great question. And I think a lot of the times where crypto companies fall short on security is, I think over time, humans in general drift towards comfort and the path of least resistance. And unfortunately, building things securely and following security practices is like chewing glass at times. And sometimes you don't want to do it, but unfortunately, you always have to. Whether it's like something as simple as pushing something through a multi-sig, right? In addition to getting all of the signatures for it, you also have to make sure the thing that you're signing is actually correct. And it's like implementing all of these like standard operating procedures, having multiple engineers review transactions. I think DeFi is pretty good at the audit side of things, but is not super great at the operational security side of things. Like we saw this with Drift, right? A multi-$100 million protocol that got fully drained because it was something like a two-signer multi-sig, and so they only had to exploit 2 points, and then all of the funds were gone. And no one looked at this because everyone goes to Drift and they see, oh, Drift has so many audits, it's safe, and it's like, yes, the smart contracts were safe, but the access controls behind them were not safe. One of the great things about FOGO is that FOGO is fully SVM compatible, and so for us, this makes the smart contract security sides of things relatively easy as well, because Ignition is able to leverage the heavily audited code bases from Solana. I think one of the things that the Solana Foundation did really well is they have these sort of core code bases that were built by them, audited many times, like the LST and stuff. All of this is like from the foundation. And so for us, it was like, okay, we're already building on battle tested code, and so the security, the smart contract side of things is already 90% of the way there, and then we just need to make sure the other 10% of the smart contracts are fine, which is where audits come in. But I really think like security is like mostly on the operational side of things, and I think audits, while super important, I don't think that's actually where we see a lot of the exploits, at least today. I think over the past year, mostly every big exploit has been on the operational side rather than on the smart
Yeah,
contract side.
100%. I wanted to, sort of like pitch in to that answer and say, I think the reason for that is that smart contract audits have become a de facto standard. Like everyone is doing them before they launch because it's somewhat mandated by the community. On the other hand, operational security audits are just starting to pick up with, stride. being done on Solana by Asymmetric Research and a bunch of other security firms, including us ourselves, and also the SEAL certifications that have just kicked off a few weeks ago. And they're focusing more on operational audits, but operational security, but I still don't see too many projects doing them. I think as we see more and more events happening on the operational side, we will see more community members mandating projects having those kind of certifications.
Yeah, for sure. And I also think like security on the operational side of things is very much a culture thing as well at the end of the day, and it needs to come from the top down. And it's like sometimes I feel like I'm being the most paranoid person on the team, but it's like if I'm not the most paranoid person about every single thing that could go wrong, like for example, not an ignition, but like we're building out this Hyperwave Prime product, and it's been like one of the biggest challenges we had was that um, we run a strategy on top of Lido right now, and the way that Lido works is you have this API key which gives you sort of low latency access to the Lido exchange, and although you can trade from mainnet, the latency from the contract on mainnet to the Lido exchange is a couple of minutes, and so it's really unfeasible to trade directly from mainnet, which means you can't do things like, okay, I can put a smart contract in front of a bot, and that smart contract is going to be able to control what functions and what parameters the bot can put in. You're sort of at the whims of the Lido API key, and the Lido API key itself is open access. I think one of the things that we would like to see on the security side of these perp dexes is the ability to um, really lock down these API keys, as in their current forms from both Hyperliquid and Lido. There's no good way to, have this granular control of what a specific API key can do. And so the way that we ended up having to sort of design around this was by working with Hypernative to develop a monitoring solution that is watching the bot off chain, and then if it detects something that the bot shouldn't be doing, in the case of a key exploit, it immediately shuts down the vault from mainnet. And it's like, while we were designing this solution, you feel so paranoid thinking about this edge case that may never happen, but you never want to be in the position where when it does happen, you're not prepared, because the team can be asleep, and although even if someone gets access to a Lido API key, the amount of things that they can do is quite limited. Like you can't transfer money out of the account. The way you would have to extract value is by essentially wash trading with the token you hold. So it's still very difficult, but it's like I feel like there's this level of paranoia that you need to be, and it's like sometimes you feel insane trying to do some of the security stuff, but I think there's just a right way to build things.
Quickly answers my next question as well. It was about how do you basically, from the top, push this kind of security culture within Liquid Labs. So yeah, I think like that pretty much answers that question. And I want to double click on what you just mentioned with the vaults. You've recently opened early access to Hyperwave Prime, and this gives fund managers compliant, mandate configured yield vaults. This is what you were just talking about. And the question there is, what's the biggest structural hurdle that is still keeping traditional institutions from just fully deploying into DeFi?
Yeah. So like one of the main reasons we started building this out is like we were operating these vaults sort of directly to retail on chain. And so we had these vaults and everything was behind a smart contract and every single function was gated. And so the design space of what you can do there in terms of generating yield is quite restricted. Like, what we're building today with a specific fund where we are using a Lido API key, it introduces these trust assumptions where you need to have a good relationship with the person that you're working with. And I think like one of the toughest things that we've had to engineer around, and I think this is also what makes it hard for these institutions to come on chain, is they are not used to the adversarial environment that is Web3. Web3 is the most PvP place that you can be building, and they simply don't understand that there is no undo button or there's no way to go back if you lose the money. And so, when we're building out this software, essentially what we have done is built, like a management software for them to be able to make these vaults, deploy funds into them, and then manage strategies. But we have to build it in a way that is almost like childproof, where because we can't expect these institutions to know the intricacies of on-chain, and that's what we are helping them navigate. And I think like institutions just feel uncomfortable coming on chain when there is no sort of like undo button, because that's what happens in TradFi. When something breaks in TradFi, you shut it down. Like, example, the Kospi dropped like 8% today, and they triggered the circuit breakers. That doesn't happen on chain. If something drops, it drops, and then you lose your money. And so I think it's like helping them navigate that adversarial world, explaining the risks to them, explaining what can go wrong, being as transparent with them about the risks, and then also building the system in a way that is built in a way that it's very hard for them to make these mistakes, whether that's like having multi-factor authentication in many places. And because um for example, when they manage a vault through the dashboard, we have to think about the case where, okay, maybe they're not managing their keys properly, and even if they're using a hardware wallet, how do we design around the situation where their key gets exported? And then we came up with a solution. It's like, okay, on every transaction, there also has to be a YubiKey added as well. And this means that that specific manager, in addition to having their hardware wallet exported, their YubiKey would also have to be exported for an attacker to actually get in and do something. And this doesn't 100% decrease the risk. Like, they could be kidnapped and both things could happen, but it's like it just decreases the risk that something could go wrong. And it's like trying to design around this, because like when you work in Web3, you learn to build around some of these things, but it's like it's a different thing to build it for someone who hasn't been in Web3 before.
That was such a great answer. I feel like we can take a bunch of really good tidbits from there. Um, awesome, awesome stuff. So like we're getting close to the end. I wanted to ask you, you've already mentioned some really cool stuff that you guys are working out on, like the RWAs that are coming to Ignition. I was wondering if you want to tell us more about that or anything else that's cooking at Liquid Labs right now.
Yeah, for sure. Happy to chat about what we're doing on the RWA side, as I think it's going to be a big value unlock for FOGO. Like, every chain, every blockchain needs extrinsic yield. Um, by extrinsic yield, I mean yield that comes from somewhere else that is not on the blockchain. And that's exactly what Ignition's RWAs are going to be bringing to FOGO. We are taking these RWAs that exist on Solana. A lot of these RWAs have yield coming from things like reinsurance and HELOC loans, and having this yield sit natively on the chain just allows the whole system to be more capitally efficient. So, let's just say you're trading on Superluminal, instead of just sitting on vanilla USD, you can now have this thing that's yielding 10 to 11%, and then it just makes the experience of interacting with the chain a lot more capitally efficient for that user. And that's sort of something that we recognize that the chain needed and why we went down this route. And I think the way that we built the protocol is also quite interesting as well, where like instead of overcomplicating it, what we're building on the RW side is really as simple as like these things already exist on Solana. We just act as this sort of so I can't remember the word, but like this sort of like transmitter between FOGO and Solana that takes USDC on FOGO and then gives the user a representation of the RWA on FOGO, which I think is like, it's super simple, but it just unlocks so much for FOGO that is like it helps the user not have to bridge out of FOGO, mint the token on Solana, and then bridge it back. And so it's just this infrastructure that makes all these assets that already exist on Solana be able to come onto FOGO today, rather than us having to go through the whole process of trying to issue the RWAs ourselves.
That's a great answer. I'm becoming more and more bullish. We reached the rapid fire closeout where we have like a few very short questions, and I would like to kindly ask if you could answer them with either one word or one sentence. And the first question is, what do you think is one outdated security myth that you still hear in Web3?
Lindy code is safe. I think that's been really flipped with AI.
Definitely. Second question. What's one protocol outside of your own that you think is doing security right?
The guys over at Yearn are always a team to be watching and learning from, as they build everything in such an adversarial proof way.
%. Third question. This comes from our previous guest, who is Matt from Li-Fi. And he was wondering, what's the boring part of security that you think Web3 needs to focus on the most?
Being paranoid, I think, is the thing that keeps you safe the most.
Nice. And last but not least, would you like to leave a question for our next guest?
What's the compromise between safety for retail and blockchains being permissionless and uncensorable environments, and how do you navigate that?
It's a really good question. I'm curious how the next guest is going to answer that in one sentence. So with that, there you have it, folks. Abby, it's been great. I really feel like we've touched so many important security points in this episode. I, for one, wasn't expecting all of those points to be addressed in this episode. So I really enjoyed it. And I want to ask you, before we wrap it up, if you can tell everyone where they can find you, Liquid Labs, or Ignition on social media, where they should read more about what you're doing.
Yeah, for sure. You can check out Faro at faro.io. Ignition is ignition.xyz. And for Hyperwave, if you're an institution, you can reach out to us directly. Just shoot me a message on Telegram at Abhishek_CT, as Hyperwave is not as much a retail product anymore, and we're mostly targeting institutions now.
Thanks so much. Go and check those out and contact Abby, folks. Thanks again, Abby, for your time. It was a pleasure having you on.
Likewise. Thanks so much for having me on.